been mobilized to exclude marginalized people within the United States and within some of the nations within such as Pakistan and Egypt, where many of the blasphemy protests have occurred. So in many ways, I'll be picking up on some of the things that we've heard already. First point I would make is that the Coptic anti-Muslim activists who were involved in the making of this film were well aware, and I think deliberately went ahead anyway, that this film would not help Copts in Egypt who are under major stress from radical groups in Egypt. And they knew that it would likely provoke violence against Copts in Egypt. So their motivation, however they began with anger about the pressures of facing Copts in Egypt, was not one, and they call themselves, at least the person who was involved in redubbing and distributing the film, calls himself a human rights activist in Egypt. This was not something that anyone familiar with the Egyptian situation would think would be helpful to the human rights of Copts or anyone else in Egypt. I would point out also that these groups are associated with wider networks of anti-Muslim activists in the United States who were involved in the producing of several anti-Muslim films on the eve of the 2008 elections, and who are now returning with anti-Muslim films on the eve of this election. And Dish TV has decided to bring back one of the major figures in the media war here, Glenn Beck, and not as a subscription, although that's what they say they're doing, but actually as free programming for those of us like myself who buy the most basic channel, where the only news program offered is Fox News, and the others aren't given. So now we have Fox and Glenn Beck with stories about the international Muslim conspiracy and the role of Obama and his Attorney General in promoting it. That is an attempt to clearly an attempt to intervene in American politics in the same way that those who promoted the video in Egypt, a number of them Salafi activists who placed it on their websites or on their NAS TV that Professor Donner mentioned. Their aim is to marginalize different groups within Egypt and to gain certain leverage. So the irony that an anti-Muslim group a very small group of Copts in the United States and an anti-Coptic circle of Salafi Muslims in Egypt are the two groups that cooperated in making this into an international affair and an affair within both the United States and Egypt. And I think this is a structure that we see repeated throughout many of these blasphemy episodes. Let me just mention a couple aspects of this. As Professor Donner mentioned, this was originally shown on a website. The website is controlled by the Salafi preacher Muhammad bin Abdul Malik al-Zuhri. And then it was picked up by another Salafi on his NAS TV channel, Sheikh Khalid Abdullah, who has a channel with news and commentary that runs an imitation of the news and commentary format that we see in across the world now, with an anchor and a guest talking over what to do about a certain situation. So the sheikh brings on a guest to talk about this film and shows it. Now, the film itself, as Professor Donner mentioned, is deliberately made to be provocative and painful to Muslims. And it is against by all the accounts of the movements that are urging blasphemy laws, it's against the blasphemy, the notion of blasphemy regulation to show the features and face of Muhammad or of his wives in an unveiled manner. And Egyptian internet bloggers pointed out early on that by showing this on television in Egypt, these Salafi preachers were actually violating those same rules that they said they were angry about being violated by the Western producers. They're calling on the United States to ban such activity. That is not only to punish the filmmaker, but to shut down all avenues of dissemination of the film while they are disseminating it in Egypt and not calling on the Egyptian government to ban their own dissemination. They point out that they were well aware of this because in their film they actually covered over the face of Muhammad so that they wouldn't be disseminating the words of blasphemy, but they did not cover over the face of the woman figure, who I think was a representation of Aisha, Muhammad's daughter, instead of the center of Western polemics against Islam. Let me just make a few other points about Egypt and then move on to the wider circumstances. Sheikh Khalid Abdullah has been involved, and Sheikh Zubbi have been involved in anti-Coptic statements accusing Copts of treason, Copts as a people, of treason to the nation of Egypt. And there are other Salafi sites have been accusing Copts because of an issue involving a couple cases of Coptic women getting divorces, since it's illegal for Coptic women to divorce in Egypt because of the Coptic Church's stance and the Egyptian government respect for that. Then the only way a Coptic woman could get divorced is by leaving the Coptic Church. So in some cases, they have become Muslim, and in a couple of cases, they have said they want to go back to their husband. There's been controversy over that, and this has led to riots and protests. Some of these Salafi websites have claims that that Coptic churches all over Egypt have dungeons in which Muslim maidens are being held captive, and call on Muslims to liberate those the captive Muslim women. So this is the kind of situation in which the anti-Copt and the Coptic anti-Muslim groups have been, for their own agenda, stoking a controversy that hurts both groups, the most wider sets of peoples. Recently, in the aftermath of this last incident of the anti-Muslim film, several attacks on Copts have occurred. In one case, a Copt, according to the Egyptian press that I read, the popular press, and others, an Egyptian Coptic teacher was arrested after a student complained that he insulted Muhammad in class. 14 of his Sunni Muslim teacher colleagues supported the accusation. And then an investigation showed, it got the records of school attendance, and it showed that the students who made the accusation had not been in school the day he claimed to have heard the offensive remark. In another case, more recently, the Egyptian authorities have made some effort to make blasphemy, the worry about blasphemy, apply not only to non-Muslims accused of blaspheming Islam, and therefore a Salafi preacher filmed burning the Bible has been detained and is under investigation for violation of the laws against insulting other religious, insulting religion. Let me give you a couple of examples in Pakistan and return to the United States. So I'll mention a couple of the things that were mentioned before, but I'll go through a series of events that I think offer some insight into this dynamic. In the 1980s, Zia al-Haq, the general who came to power in a coup and had his elected predecessor hanged, decided to push to have the blasphemy laws made more stringent. He amended the blasphemy codes that we had talked about earlier to target the Ahmadi group in particular, a long-term target of some of the Muslim religious parties in Pakistan. And one of the new aspects of the code states that it is the crime of blasphemy includes insinuating things that might be insulting to the Prophet Muhammad, his family, or his companions. That, of course, leads a large range of interpretation. He also had the Constitution amended in a way that would make it very difficult to change these laws. And indeed, from the beginning, there was the implication that attempting to change these laws was attempting to change the law of Muhammad and was itself an act of blasphemy. And that implication was brought forth in the last couple of years in quite dramatic fashion. The Salman Rushdie affair started out as a South Asian and British affair with a long history of British-South Asian dynamic. Protests by the South Asian Muslim community in Britain against the book that started out quite nonviolent. A small group were shown in states of excited animation, often called Muslim rage. And I hope you've all had a chance to look at the wonderful responses by Muslims to the Newsweek Muslim Rage heading. But the role of the media helped inflame that group, or enlarge that group to where it became this ever-present large threat. And that provoked a vehement reaction among British intellectuals, many of them long-term anti-colonialist and liberal voices, or those who saw themselves as such, who began not only defending Rushdie's book, but denouncing Islam as a fundamentally intolerant religion, or as a religion that developed a culture in which people could not tell a difference between fiction and non-fiction. Let me just say that Rushdie's book is considered to be sophisticated, but the actual chapter that was most controversial is in many ways very similar to the film as described by Professor Dodd. In the middle of a magic realism, complex discussion of immigration and hybridity and marginality, there's a chapter of extreme clarity from a narrative point of view, very graphic, in which wives who just happen to have the name of the wives of Muhammad in tradition are engaged in a brothel. Their various proclivities and sexual specialties are described in some detail, at the end of which a figure recognizable as Muhammad from tradition comes back and slaughters them all in a particularly cruel fashion. So if you took the kind of disjointed points from the film and put them in a kind of sophisticated novel, Rushdie was out recently in a New Yorker cartoon and said, you know, I never really set out to insult Islam. I wasn't angry at Islam. People read it that way. It's all about Margaret Thatcher's London. And I'm thinking, you know, I don't want to be a literary critic, but the literary critic would say that's fine for the rest of the novel, but why was this recognizably telling us something profound or interesting about Margaret Thatcher's London? So I think Muslims are able to tell fact from fiction. And let me just give my own kind of Montana analogy. Guy goes into a bar or a coffee shop or the local Moose Lodge or the Catholic Lodge or the Masonic Lodge, sees a bunch of people and says, hey, by the way, I just had this thought, or I had a dream. And then he said, I dreamt I saw these women, and he gives the name of one of the people, men there, his mother, and his sisters, and his daughters. They all had these names, and they were, of course, this is just a dream, it's just kind of a thought, and they were doing this and this and this. I don't think you get very far in the story. And I don't think it's because the guys in Anaconda, Montana don't understand the difference between fact and fiction. The Ayatollah Khomeini intervened in that. It was basically a quarrel of long-standing British literature mimicking South Asians and the lionization in Britain of Salman Rushdie, whose other books, by all accounts, are very well written. And Khomeini intervened shortly before his death in a brilliant action geopolitically to get one blow against the British society that has its own long history in Iran, going back to the 1953 Anglo-British coup and back beyond before that. Let me just mention a few more cases. The epitome of blasphemy, of the Zia al-Haq blasphemy world that was created by these, came about, I think, as I read the human rights reports from Pakistan, by Pakistani investigators, came to this kind of, the one case I think is illustrative is the man called Mushtaq. In one school, a teacher was in a dispute with several teaching candidates who believed the teacher got the job in an unjustified way. An accusation that the teacher had blasphemed Muhammad appeared. The Sunni Muslim teachers in the school, a number of them agreed with it. The man was arrested for the capital offense. An investigation, the police did not really investigate anything before the arrest. And it doesn't really matter if one is convicted in Pakistan necessarily, because in the cases that become high profile through this web of media and enlargement, locally and nationally and internationally, once a case becomes high profile, that person can never be saved. Prosecutors have been assassinated for not prosecuting. Judges have been assassinated for letting people out on appeals or not convicting. And in this case, the alleged perpetrator was lynched inside the police station. And later on, an investigation said, well, who made the initial accusation, and what was it? And the only thing that people said was it was a man named Mushtaq. So this is what I would call a certain kind of cultural terror that can occur, and it can be usually the cases I've seen. These things result from personal disputes, land disputes, often between landowners and the business or merchant groups. Word disputes. One case, 3 women working on a farm. One of them, Christian, was accused of blasphemy, arrested, a capital offense, large protest. One of the people who came out, 2 of the people who came out and said, this law needs to be changed because these kind of things are not a process of any kind of rational investigation. Was a prominent politician, the governor of Punjab, who was assassinated. His assassin was proud of what he did, and a number of young lawyers who had protested against anti-constitutional actions under the military regime that had fallen a couple of years before, were showering the assassin with rose petals. And several radical groups published a quote, fatwa, unquote, stating that anyone who attended the funeral of this leader was as guilty as he was of blasphemy. He was guilty of blasphemy for calling on a change or an emendation to the blasphemy code, and anyone who attended his funeral was guilty of blasphemy for attending the funeral of the blasphemer. The response under considerable pressure was that a large number of people from wide sectors of Pakistan attended the funeral. But that is the good news. The bad news is that pretty much, according to the Pakistani press, I mean, pretty much any discussion of amending that blasphemy code or the Constitution regarding it have been stifled. Latest example, a girl named Rimsha, you've probably heard the story. She was accused of blasphemy. She's a developmentally disabled girl of 12 or 13 years old. She was caught with some ashes. The allegation was that she burned a copy of the Quran. Now the accuser, a local sheikh, has been arrested, and some of his Muslim colleagues and people who know them say they saw him slip pieces of the Quran into this young woman, Rimsha's pack. And so this is one of the few cases that I've read about recently where an accuser has actually come under any kind of scrutiny for the accusation. And of course, he would be guilty of blasphemy if those allegations were true. I guess what I would say is the issue of blasphemy has a long tradition, exactly as it's discussed by our earlier speakers. And most Americans that I know are unaware of that tradition and unaware that why these sensitivities are so strong. As it's pointed out, there are restrictions on free speech in the West that many don't recognize. Iranian President Ahmadinejad has made a point of sarcastic referrals to this. The point he's making is quite valid, but he doesn't make it in a way that's going to be listed. But the sarcasm is leveled against the banning of Holocaust denial in many of the countries in Europe, in countries where, in many of the countries where the free speech is viewed as absolutely core value. So the Muslims that ban insulting of other religions are against this core value, but Europeans that ban the denial of the Holocaust or other genocide are not against this core value. The United States does not have that particular law, but if any untenured faculty member is even accused of Holocaust denial, and I'm familiar with one case that happened in Chicago, that accusation without any kind of proof or backup is enough to destroy that person's career. So I'd like to end there with the notion that surrounding these blasphemy episodes are groups, local groups, national groups, and transnational groups that each have a stake and will cooperate with one another in actions that provoke violence against the very people